Okay, thank you very much, Laurence. I want to take the opportunity to thank Patrick Marcelin for this very kind invitation. After many years discussing metabolic alterations in hepatitis C, it's quite an honor to be invited to discuss NAFLD and cancer. Here's my disclaimer. I wish I had some myself personally. Let's start immediately from the prevalence of the problem. So the prevalence is quite important. You'll see in a moment why. I mean, NAFLD is the most prevalent chronic liver disease worldwide. And I remember a famous sentence by Sheila Sherlock in the 60s when she was publishing her seminal textbook, claiming that, in fact, the most important elevation of liver enzymes is fat. And it's still true today, after many years. It's going to be worse in the future decades. NAFLD accounts for about 25% of the global population. This is quite patchy, but still extremely significant, especially as compared to the data which were published in WHO Global Hepatitis Report for hepatitis B and C. They are paling faces to the NAFLD prevalence. And you see here it's quite a patchy prevalence around the world. Some countries seem to be less affected. Probably alcohol is more important here, but many others are extremely affected, and the epidemic is ravaging and expanding to this very day. And I'm insisting on this point because I believe most of the people in this audience are hepatologists, and we are used to see essentially the tip of the iceberg. We've been used to follow patients with hepatitis B and C for decades. NAFLD is actually coming to hepatologists only when they hit the very end of the stage of the natural history. Most of these patients are currently seen by obesity specialists and diabetologists. You see here the reason why also screening strategies should be targeted by different specialists. It's been known since the very beginning of a history of discovery that NAFLD prevalence correlates with obesity. It's the most important single correlate. I mean, a huge number of papers have shown that consistently across the world, all over the countries, the same observation is holding true. And if you look at the numbers, I mean, we are used to consider the United States as the most affected, but indeed, the country which is the highest percentage of obesity are in the Gulf states. Kuwait currently is the leading country in the world in terms of obesity prevalence. And many other affluent countries, you see, are also heavily affected, and especially in overweight. It's actually plateauing in the United States currently. It's still increasing in the Gulf states. There are certainly some genetic factors contributing to that, apart from lifestyle considerations, of course. We're talking about almost 800 million people who are obese across the world. I just have to mention one study which was published under the auspices of the European Association for the Study of Liver, the so-called EPA Health report made by UK Health Forum. It's a very important landmark paper sponsored by us, which accounts for the prevalence of all liver disorders across Europe. It's very important also the obesity data, most recent ones, by sex, and affecting something between 10 and 20% of the European population. Obesity is not the only correlate of NAFLD. You see here is very important meta-analysis made by Zoberi Nossi, published 3 years ago. He analyzed prevalence, incidence, and outcomes in NAFLD, and you see that NAFLD patients are heavily affected also by diabetes, dyslipidemia, hypertriglyceridemia, hypertension, and the percentages go up in the NASH form, which means that NAFLD and NASH are definitely the histological correlate of the metabolic syndrome. Other correlates are age. Number of patients with the NAFLD increase with age, and ethnicity. Even though the data regarding ethnicity are quite contradictory, many studies have pointed out the role of genes probably in Hispanic population, Mexican Americans. Several studies, especially for NHANES database, huge studies, but we'll see that also Asians seem to be affected when analyzed, especially in the Far East. Far East countries are quite affected by this point. So natural history has been explained very nicely by Massimo Pinzani. And I also thank him for introducing all the pathophysiological concepts, which I will not detail anymore. we've been going through all these stages from a simple steatosis to mild lobular inflammation, NASH, mild fibrosis, advanced fibrosis, cirrhosis, and hepatocellular carcinoma. So given the sheer number of people with the NAFLD in the general population, we may end up concluding that indeed there must be a huge prevalence of people with severe fibrosis in the general population just due to that. And this is actually true. It was shown, for example, it is very important, a paper done in a general population, so we did a random extraction from the general population in the Barcelona metropolitan area. They collected 3,000 patients, all adults, and they measure liver stiffness. And you can see from this data, in fact, out of 2,710 persons, 3.3% at the transient stiffness values higher than 9 kilopascals. And this after excluding hepatitis C and B alcohol abuse. It's very important, means that 3% of the general population is actually affected by significant liver fibrosis due to NAFLD. And you also see in this paper also the correlates, again, the male sex, liver enzyme elevation, which is a proxy for inflammation, even though we just heard from Massimo Pinzani that it is not the most important, this is not the single most important factor, but all the factors associated with the metabolic syndrome, obesity, glucose, low HDL level, hypertriglyceridemia, and type 2 diabetes are all involved. Let's look at the progression. There are some papers which have been producing repeated liver biopsies in patients. There is very nice one study which is prospective, done by Vincent Wang and the Chinese University of Hong Kong, very precisely determined that the evolution in these patients at the baseline versus 36 months later. All 52 patients received the second liver biopsy. And you see here that the NAFLD activity score at month 36 increased about 1/3 of patients, and the same applies to fibrosis progression. So this is not a benign disease, and also at early stages. And early stages is very nicely shown, but another very important paper by Macpherson, Swiss of Newcastle. Again, a hospital-based cohort study on repeated liver biopsies. We had 108 patients with at least 2 liver biopsies, separated by at least 7 to 6 years. Has to be said that many patients were lost during the follow-up, but it's still a small proportion of the old cohort at the very beginning. But still, the delta cohort is quite significant in terms of progression. Progression was less than the Chinese paper, but the fibrosis progression was more significant. And it's a very important observation by this very nice and very landmark study was that even bland steatosis may progress to NASH, to inflammation, which means it is not a benign disease, not even in the early stages, as Professor Pinzani just marked. And the most important, there is no difference in proportional fibrosis progression between those with the simple steatosis or NASH at the index biopsy, which introduces the problem of what is actually inducing the fibrosis progression. And I want also to stress again the concept that it is fibrosis and not NASH which predicts survival. There are many studies on this point. This is the multi-center, multinational study published by Angulo many years ago, shows very nicely how the survival free of liver transplantation is independent of the presence of NASH. It's actually affected by the presence of fibrosis. And as you all know, the important conclusion of this study was not only fibrosis as a marker of a progression, but also the causes of death. As you know, cardiovascular is leading, followed by cancer, followed by cirrhosis as a third. So now cancer. Cancer is actually the one of our headaches in NAFLD because it's not associated exclusively with cirrhosis, and it's been said that repeatedly, and I will be repeating myself in my talk. Numerically, it seems lower than other chronic liver disorders. It is just one paper among many others. You see here, even though there was not statistical significance during the follow-up, it's a very nice study, big one from Cleveland Clinic, showing that the occurrence of HCC is less than in hepatitis C. But if you think about the size of the prevalence of the epidemic, clearly, in terms of sheer numbers, it is a huge public health problem. It's not recognized in a proper way. The HEPA Health report showed that, in fact, if you look at the numbers of cancers in Europe, non-alcohol-related and non-viral, this seems very small indeed. This is the green, with the possible exception of Sweden and Netherlands. But otherwise, the vast majority still seems to be associated with hepatitis C and hepatitis B, not to talk about alcohol in some Eastern European countries. And this also reflected, possibly this underreporting is especially reflected in the statistics related to mortality due to liver disease consequences, especially the orange bars here is unknown etiology of liver-related mortality, which cannot be really understood or accepted. But in those centers where these data are being collected very precisely, you see that the size of the problem is increasing over time. This is a very important paper from Helen Reeves' group in Newcastle, published by Dyson a few years ago, showing that across the range of 10 years, the proportion of HCC attributable to NAFLD was increased by a factor of 10. Also negligible in these first years and became the most important reason for HCC in 2010. And these data have been reproduced by many groups. Raluca Pais with Vlad Rassiu published this very nice paper. This is actually HCC in patients undergoing liver resection across the period 95 to 2014. Again, the increase of NAFLD-related HCC increased by a factor of about 10 again. And the same applies to liver transplant candidate with HCC. This is a multinational study. You see here how the number of HCC-related NAFLD referred for transplant increased by about 12-fold compared to the increase of other causes of liver cancer referred for the same indication. So these numbers are bound to increase even further during the next decades. Everybody is aware of the epidemic of overweight, obesity, and morbid obesity across the world. And the same applies to diabetes. We are talking about 800 million people with diabetes 2025, which is WHO data. This is quite impressive. And again, Gulf states seems to be the most affected across the world. Increasing the NAFLD prevalence will imply also an increase in fibrosis, severe stages of fibrosis. This is a modeling done by Chris Estes and Homi Razavi at the CDA Center for Analysis, and you see here in the country with 30% of global population, we consider 8 different countries was part of this study. In countries with 30% of the global population, severe fibrosis cases related to NAFLD will increase by a factor of 2, we will double by 2030. Which also will have consequences on the disease burden in terms of the incident, the compensated cirrhosis here, incident liver-related mortality, and HCC due to NAFLD, with some variations among countries, but still is quite impressive across the board. So the trouble with HCC NAFLD has been said by Professor Pinzani is that a sizable proportion of cases occur in non-cirrhotic liver. And we don't know exactly why, nobody knows exactly the reason for that, but you see here in this study from Mittal that 36% about were in non-cirrhotic liver, so the risk was increased by 5-fold compared to hepatitis C. And the trouble with the non-cirrhotic NAFLD-associated HCC is very nicely underlined by this study, by Italian multicenter prospective perception study published by Fabio Piscaglia a few years ago. The proportion even increased to 54%, and what is really troublesome is that compared to HCV, cancer associated with NAFLD were younger, less frequently diagnosed during surveillance programs, of course, were larger, they were not cirrhotic for that reason, they were less frequently within Milan criteria, less frequently BCLC stage 0, and more frequently showing infiltrative pattern. Luckily, I mean, when they did some propensity score analysis, the overall rate of patients submitted to curative treatments was similar in 2 groups because these actually less advanced liver disorders, but still is quite troublesome if you want to think about in terms of screening. Which actually leads me to the next slide, which shows for this very nice review article by Quentin Nasty, just appeared in Nature Reviews, that indeed the risk of developing cancer across the natural history of NAFLD is a continuum. So we don't really see a stepping stone here when we reach this final stage of cirrhosis. Of course, this is an increase, but the increase is across the board. So it starts very early, it's a very early, very rare risk here, and increases gradually due to many factors which we know only in small detail. Professor Pinzani mentioned oxidative stress, which is certainly very important since the very early stage, but we don't know exactly all the mechanisms which lead to cancer. We know some of them. I mean, we certainly do know that metabolic changes are very important. Again, if you look at the VA series and the Italian series, patients have more frequently diabetes and more frequently hypertension. So the metabolic syndrome is a cofactor, a very important factor. Obesity, clearly. was shown in this UNOS database. You see diabetes and the body mass index higher than 30 are associated. Incidentally, you see here the Asian ethnicity background may actually be a very strong factor contributing to HCC. When they did the multiple regression analysis, obese versus lean, they showed that obesity is an independent predictor only in alcoholic and cryptogenic cirrhosis, which actually relates us to NAFLD. Same data from another study from the United States with the 2 cohorts. Cirrhosis developed cancers. Diabetes is a very important factor. They validated this data in a UNOS registrants in NAFLD cirrhosis, the big numbers you see again. And again, the most important factor was the presence of diabetes. I would like to mention hypothyroidism as a risk factor. It's important because some drugs are currently being developed for activate the thyroid receptor in the liver, the resmetirom, for example. 2 case control studies, one is from Mayo Clinic, the other one from MD Anderson Cancer Centers, and the etiology of hepatocellular carcinoma. You see here how many patients with unknown etiology had a history of hypothyroidism. These data were partially confirmed by the Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, you see, but only in women. The odds ratio was not as high, but still was independent of many other factors, especially metabolic factors, very important. This effect was independent of diabetes. Genes, well, genetic susceptibility is certainly important, has been appreciated by many studies. There is a variability in response to obesity. We know that the disorder clusters in family, you know, very historical data showing liver enzyme levels are heritable. And Dalazur study and Hensey study show that ethnicity may play a major role in that. I just mentioned a couple of studies. One is the effect of PNPLA3 genotype, 148 methionine mutation on NAFLD-related HCC, which is independent of fibrosis progression. It's very important because the carriage of each G allele is associated with a doubling of HCC risk. This is an additive model. According to this meta-analysis, however, there's a dominant model that counts, you see here, and they say very important that the association is conferred. But the data is quite heterogeneous. And the reason why we, at EASL, we did not consider introducing NAFLD genetic variants as this time into the clinical practice. This is not yet necessary outside of clinical studies. At this stage, no recommendation can be made on the time of surveillance and the cost-effectiveness considering PNPLA3 variants. There are some fascinating stories that are being developed, the transmembrane 6 superfamily factor 2, the membrane-bound acetyltransferase and the telomerase promoter. Some variants have been associated with the cancer. The number of studies is still very little, and we cannot really conclude anything, especially we cannot translate this into clinical recommendations. I will not delve into pathogenesis. I mean, I will refer you to this very nice review. I would like to stress, among other mechanisms, oxidative stress, which is extremely important, DNA damage repair failure in a cancer, and also the role of autophagy, which is nicely reminded by Professor Pinzani. Free fatty acid overflow activates mTOR, and this leads to a decrease of autophagy in the liver, which is certainly a major player in cancer development. So if metabolic syndrome is the most important cofactor of developing cancer, regular exercise should decrease liver tumor development. This was very nicely in a very elegant study shown by Dr. Piguet and Jean-François Dufour group in Bern in the mice model. They use a hepatocyte-specific PTEN deficient mice. After fluoxetine, they developed cancer and steatohepatitis, and they were fed a standard diet, but randomly divided in 2 groups, exercise or sedentary groups. The exercise was to use a motorized treadmill, as you know, the experiment. And you see here, of course, those controls develop. Controls without sedentary, they do develop steatohepatitis and cancer, and those who are engaged in extraneous physical activity activate AMPK, and they inhibit mTORC1, and they have developed a reduced tumor number, size, total mass per liver, and cell proliferation without affecting steatosis. And the activation of MPKs seems to be a central factor in this. These data were also observed in human cohorts. There is a multinational cohort study. EPIC was published in Journal of Pathology last year. It's very important. It shows that total physical activity in a huge number of persons definitely reduces the risk of developing cancer by 50%. And this is also true if you compare strenuous or vigorous physical activity versus no activity at all. The same author also concluded that, only the cancer, primary liver cancer, was related to the physical activity. And in fact, the physical activity did not decrease intrahepatic and non-gallbladder extrahepatic biliary duct cancer. The risk was independent of the liver cancer risk factors. It did not vary by many other factors, including body weight and alcohol consumption. You don't need to lose weight. Actually, what you do need is to increase physical activity. We've shown also in a meta-analysis by the same author here, who actually issued some notes of caution, the potential for uncontrolled confound. We know very little exactly what is really acting in this context. We insist on the physical activity. Probably we may have other confounders we don't know, genetic or other things we don't really know exactly. Also because everything is based on self-reported measures, which may be affected by many biases, especially cognitive biases, and we don't know how to measure exactly physical activity. So further studies are needed, even though the evidence is quite convincing, because everything that exercise does actually is to counteract what excess calories does. So from the physiopathological point of view, is extremely convincing, this approach. It's probably the most important, the most effective. Just a few mentioned very rapidly about metformin. So metformin is activated AMP kinase, and the meta-analysis shows that the use of metformin in diabetes patients reduces the risk of HCC versus non-users. And the chemopreventive effect of metformin is dose-dependent. It depends on also the amount of years metformin is given. This is very nicely shown by this paper here. Each year of metformin use reduces the risk of HCC by about 7%. And same applies to statins, even though the data is less impressive. Clearly, the beneficial of statins is dose-dependent, and this is very important, is independent of diabetes and cirrhosis, shown by this paper. So my take-home messages are very simple. NAFLD, first of all, is the most prevalent chronic liver disease worldwide. This is increasing. It is increasing because there is an increasing prevalence of metabolic syndrome and aging of the population, which means that NAFLD prevalence and complication will increase during the next decade. Trouble problem is that as many as 40 to 50% of HCC associated with NAFLD occur in non-cirrhotic livers. Most important risk factor of HCC in NAFLD are metabolic, but very big room for confounders, which are unknown and uncontrolled. We can easily say that lifestyle modifications at this time are currently the most effective measures to reduce the risk of HCC in NAFLD, even though everybody wants the magic bullets. There are some bullets, but I really think my only and most important take-home message is start running. And this, as you remember, those of you who have a gray hair should remember Abebe Bikila, who was won 2 marathons at Tokyo and Rome Olympic Games. By the way, he was running barefoot. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Francesco. So now we have time for questions. Is there any question in the room? Because I don't have any message on my computer laptop. No question. So finally, Francesco, simple steatosis is not anymore a benign disease because there is a lot of data suggesting that they can progress to NASH. But can you have a comment about what is simple steatosis, pure steatosis? Maybe we may have a comment from the pathologist, because when we say simple steatosis, what does it mean? Is there no inflammation? Is it pure steatosis?
I think those who have a simple steatosis and then progress, in general, the Newcastle data show that these patients have diabetes. So my point, I may be wrong, but the pathologist may actually correct me, is that steatosis is just a red flag for something else. I'm not really sure that steatosis by itself is damaging hepatocytes. I think it was introduced this concept by Professor Pinzani. Steatosis is actually an adaptive response of hepatocytes. It's adaptive response to something going wrong, which is free fatty acids overflow and many other, cytokines coming from the adipose tissue. So I'm not really sure that steatosis by itself, the accumulation of triglyceride by itself is the problem. It's actually signaling the presence of a problem. upstream, which may be free fatty acids overflow, lipotoxicity, and incapacity of a hepatocyte to adapt to the new conditions imposed by metabolic syndrome. That's my view, at least. But I mean, I don't know. I know that many people don't share this view, but that's how I saw it.
So, Pierre.
Well, again, I'm more closer to you, Francesco, than what Massimo said before. From a pathologist point of view, you can see biopsy with 100% of steatosis without any inflammation, without any fibrosis. By contrast, when you look to biopsy with fibrosis, you find fibrosis where there is inflammation, where there is balloonets, and not where there is only steatosis too. So I can just add another argument. If steatosis progress, if fibrosis progress, then usually steatosis decrease, and you all know the advanced disease with F3 or F4 without any steatosis, but with advanced fibrosis. So to me, it's a marker of the disease. If steatosis is guilty, steatosis is guilty by association, but not by causality.
It is guilty by association, exactly the expression I would use. Thank you, Pierre.
Other question in the room? So, Francesco, so we are always speaking about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, alcoholic fatty liver disease. So, is there any mixed liver disease? Because when we look for now for the liver indication for liver transplantation, there is not anymore pure alcoholic cirrhosis or pure NASH, but there is a lot of mixity. So, some alcohol, obesity, diabetes, sometimes HCV infection. So, what is your experience in Geneva?
My experience in Geneva is not pure disease. I mean, the cofactors are so many that today we are witnessing, especially due to the epidemic of metabolic syndrome. But this is mixed to many other etiologies. I fully agree with that. I mean, there is a synergy shown very nicely among these different diseases, in fact. So I think there are toxic combinations in terms of progression, especially to cancer.
What is the experience in Lille? Philippe Mathurin, do you have any experience in Lille about mixed etiology between alcohol and obesity and diabetes? Because you have a lot of data.
The question is that when you have alcohol, you are an alcoholic liver disease and obese. You cannot say it's a NAFLD and HCC. Because when you are looking at the epidemiological data, the epidemiologist would say, okay, guys, you are talking about alcoholic liver disease because they are upper the risk of alcohol. But conversely, what we completely share that has been clearly shown is that when you combine the two, the risk of HCC is higher, and probably the risk of death may be more related to HCC than decompensated in obesity, which is a key issue. But it's difficult to say, I have metabolic future, I'm drinking, so therefore I'm a mixed disease, that's for sure. But in terms of epidemiological data, those patients will be classified as alcoholic liver disease. Yeah. So I think we need to consider this, because otherwise we'll be in opposite, in contraindication with regard to the epidemiological specialists will tell us that we are putting like a nightmare in the epidemiological data. So I think it's very important to consider this.
And I want to just make a comment about the mix of alcohol, obesity, and the cross-influence. My experience in London is that unless you go into ethnic groups where alcohol is prevented because of religious reason, there is no real NAFLD or ALD anymore. Now, ALD, because you have some alcoholics, they drink Fernet Branca at 6 in the morning, then it's an alcoholic. But the rest of the population, they all drink like 3-4 pints a day, and they are all overweight. So it is very difficult to make a clear-cut epidemiological. So, but this is a bit of a taboo, because if you look at the recruitment clinical trial, the exclusion of alcohol excess is something that you tend to forget or not to consider very much, but should be more honest.
Okay, if there is no more question, we can move to the next presentation. Thank you, Francesco.